Bibliophiles of the internet. Today I'm here to share my January wrap-up. For me, I think January tends to take on a lot of undue weight in terms of setting the tone for the entire rest of the year, which is so grossly unfair to January, but I digress. But overall, with maybe one or two exceptions, I think I did actually have a pretty good reading month, so let's just get into it. I did also start the new job. Thank you so much to everyone who sent well wishes. I very much appreciate it. I just wanted to note that and to once again say please be patient with me as I try to find that work-content balance. Anyways, the first book I listened to in January was In Memoriam by Alice Wynne, and I was granted access to the audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, which is read by the incomparable Christian Coulson. This is queer historical fiction set in 1914 England, right in the midst of World War I. We're following two older schoolboys, Henry Gaunt and Sidney Elwood, who are studying at a boarding school, and they're hearing these reports back about the war and all their former classmates who have gone on to serve. At the same time, they're navigating this budding attraction between them, which is obviously forbidden, and when he feels like they're maybe getting dangerously too close to each other, that's when Gaunt decides to let himself get drafted. There's also layers to that choice because Gaunt is half German and his family wants him to help bolster their reputation since Germany is one of England's enemies at this time, so that's also part of why he left. But much to his surprise and his horror, Elwood soon rushes to follow him and they reunite on the front lines. Content warnings for death, grief, and war-related trauma, graphic descriptions of death, corpses, and injuries, experienced homophobia and bullying, some sexual content, brief references to suicide, descriptions of imprisonment and starvation, as well as experienced ableism and internalized ableism. Shout out to Russell from Ink and Paper Blog for putting this on my radar. It is so incredibly up my alley, and I loved it so much. I wanted to read it first thing in 2024 because those of you who are playing along at home might remember that my first book of 2023 was The World and All That It Holds, which is also a queer World War I story, and that was one of my top books of the year without question. So I was like, let's do it again and just see what happens. And I don't know what it says about me, but I think I'm onto something here because this was fantastic. Yes, it's absolutely harrowing to read. The story is very grounded in the realities of war. Like, if you want to read a book that actually puts you in the trenches with these soldiers, you're gonna get that kind of action and that vantage point in this story. But at the same time, that unthinkable carnage is not glorified. It's not there just for the sake of being there. And the story also very deftly tackles the consequences of war and the kinds of psychological trauma that comes with it. So it's not shying away from those difficulties and complexities. And also at the same time, it's an incredibly tender love story between these two young men who desperately want to love each other but just don't know how to. And their inability to know is not actually their fault. But there's still a softness to their love story. Like, Elwood is a poet, and there's so many times when he doesn't know how to tell Gaunt that he loves him in so many words, but he'll recite poetry to him that sort of says those things on his behalf. And ultimately, I think this story is still hopeful. It's about these characters trying to build something for each other and with each other without even knowing what the end result can look like, without even knowing if they're going to make it there or how. It shows these characters enduring horrific circumstances, but also knowing that they can survive it if they have each other. And if I can just say really quickly, the audiobook is stunning. Christian Coulson is a master of his craft, and by his craft, I mean his acting and his voice. He narrates the story so tenderly, so beautifully, but it's also really well directed and produced because there's a really cool use of surround sound at some points and also overlapping audio when the list of deceased and injured soldiers are being sent out to the papers. It's so cool and it's so incredibly effective. This was such an emotionally arresting story. I experienced every emotion a person can possibly experience over the course of this book. It's masterfully crafted, incredibly well researched, thoughtful, beautiful, impossibly tender. Again, if any of this even remotely appeals to you, please pick this up. It's truly incredible, and I gave it 5 stars. After that, I read an arc of 10 Bridges I've Burnt by Brontes Purnell, which actually comes out really soon on February February 13th from MCD Books. Brontez Purnell is a queer black poet, author, and musician. He's hailed as the gay punk messiah, which I maintain is one of the most badass monikers a person can ever have. And this is such a fascinating collection because it's actually a memoir written in verse. So it's formatted in a series of poems, but the content of those poems is explicitly autobiographical, explicitly non-fiction. There's a lot of ground covered in this teeny tiny book, everything from Brontez remembering a time when he got into a fight at a poetry convention, his experiences being in the writing room for various television shows, ruminations on his queer experiences as a radically subversive older black man. It goes to a lot of different places, and they're all great. Content warnings for references to sexual content, mentions of alcohol and drug abuse, mentions of parental death, some descriptions of physical assault and violence, and some explorations of experienced fat phobia and diet culture. If you remember, I read Brontez Purnell's other traditionally published book, 100 Boyfriends, around this time last year, and it absolutely punched me in the face in the best way possible. So it should not be a surprise when I say that 10 Bridges I've Burnt packs that exact same punch, despite its even more condensed format. This is not a brag, like it really and truly is not, but I do have a degree in writing, and I have formally studied poetry as part of that, so I'm gonna geek out a little bit about what this book is doing just for a second. I think what the casual poetry reader has to understand is that when poets write autobiographical poetry, it's a profound subversion of the medium. A lot of people will pick up a poetry collection and incorrectly assume that the voice you're reading from is synonymous with the author, that the author is indistinguishable from the perspective of the poems. But that's not necessarily true. And in fairness, a great deal of poetry is written from and grounded in personal experience, so sometimes the conflation is warranted. But just as fiction has a narrator who may or may not be a stand-in for the author, poetry has a speaker, and the speaker can either be the poet's voice or it cannot. Anyways, the point of all that is to say that Brontez Purnell writing this collection and explicitly flagging it as memoir, explicitly saying, this is about me, this is about my life, these are experiences I've had, this collection is an amalgamation of my existence, is kind of metal as fuck. That goes against poetry's default settings in some ways. And I think this verse memoir is so incredibly well executed. It's poignant, but it's accessible. It effortlessly weaves back and forth between existential macro experiences and micro experiences that are very pointedly focused. And point blank, I have no idea how he was able to pull this off, which for me is the mark of truly exceptional work. What I love about Purnell's work is that he constantly reminds me that writing doesn't have to be what's accepted as traditionally beautiful or lofty or obfuscated or overly complicated in order to be profound, in order to convey truth and to convey meaning. Poetry is about the intentionality, not the stylistic choices. I just love that Brontez Purnell's whole vibe is just like throwing his two middle fingers up to the sky. That's the energy he infuses into his writing every single moment, and I love it. He's like, why can't poetry be about that one time I beat someone's ass? Why can't poetry be structured like a punchline? Why can't poetry be whatever I need it to be and whatever I say it is? Long story short, I love this. There's just nothing else to say. It's aggressively subversive and an unapologetic upheaval of cultural and poetic norms. I laughed, I was surprised, I was sent into an absolute spiral after reading some of these reflections. Purnell truly is one of a kind. I gave this 4.5 stars. Now, one thing you need to know about me is that I am, of course, subscribed to Silvia Moreno Garcia's newsletter, and in early January, she recommended a book that she had reviewed recently for the LA Times that I had never heard about before, but then I could not get it out of my mind from that moment. And that book was none other than You Dreamed of Empires by Alvaro Enrique, translated from Spanish by Natalia Wimmer, and the audiobook, once again shared with me by PRH Audio, is read by Gabriel Borras. I need you to listen to every single word of this next sentence. This is a surrealist piece of historical fiction written by a Mexican author that reimagines the fall of Tenochtitlan but spins it as a hallucinatory, gritty tale of anti-colonial revenge. So it's set in 1519, following the days when the infamously horrendous Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortés entered Tenochtitlan with his armies and his entire retinue, and the extremely terse relationship that developed between him and Moctezuma as their two empires began to clash. So the Spanish are obviously planning to conquer this ancient empire, but they're also at a loss because they don't know how to navigate this culture, much less the labyrinthine palace, which puts them at a very distinct disadvantage. But also, Moctezuma is being caught up in his own hubris and may not be able to see this threat for what it truly is. Content warnings for references to slavery, mentions of sacrifice and bloodletting in reference to rituals and religious practices, instances of drug use, brief descriptions of rape, explorations of colonization and massacre, and some instances of graphic violence. Listening to this was such a visceral, full-body experience for me. This is exactly the kind of revisionist history that we deserve because it's very purposefully revising history in the direction of decolonization. It's taking this very widely accepted narrative of the all-powerful Spanish armies conquering a quote-unquote uncivilized indigenous empire with ease and reclaiming that, rewriting it in such a way that shows the true sophistication and power that was wielded by the Triple Alliance. The versions of Spain and Tenochtitlan that the author writes in this story are very intentionally divorced from our modern sensibilities, from the modern lenses through which we often understand and posit the characterization of these entities. And again, it's because the modern narrative around this conquest is unequivocally weighted towards the Spanish, towards the conquerors, towards the ones who would go on to write the histories. So I think that reclamation is incredibly powerful, and besides that very intentional shift in dynamic, on a plot level, it's also just such a fascinating read. It's part political drama, part mystery in some ways, part surrealist horror story in regards to this unnavigable palace. Even though it's told in a very condensed timeline, it's impossible to not be sucked in by what's happening on the page. Every interaction between these two powerhouses is so intensely charged. It's one of those stories where the smallest movements, the most seemingly offhand choices, are a power play. And it's just so intriguing to watch those exchanges and see how both leaders are so drastically overestimating themselves. That's the other fascinating thing about this story. It really understands the power of what's lost in translation, which is a little bit meta in some ways, but really appropriate because everything Cortés and Moctezuma communicate has to be filtered through two translators. So there's an exchange and sometimes diminishing of power happening there too, not only in what can and cannot be communicated solely through language, but also with what the translators might choose to withhold or not withhold. But the intensity and the unexpected swerve of the ending was really my favorite part because the story takes a big swing. It goes very meta, the scope of it broadens in such an exciting way, and I really respect Enrique for taking that kind of risk. And again, if I could just quickly say something about the audiobook, I loved Gabriel Borges' performance so much. I'm so glad they went with not only a Mexican voice actor, but also that there's no attempt to suppress his accent, which is so strong, so pronounced, so beautiful, and they really let him lean into it, again, intentionally and unapologetically, which led to such a transcendent listening experience. And the performance of the book in that way really lends itself to upholding the themes of the story, which I feel like is about how it's never too late to kill the colonizer, so to speak. Not literally per se, but in more of a metaphorical sense. It's never too late for those of us who live in deeply colonized societies built on principles of colonial violence to interrogate the ways that we might carry the colonizer within us and start pushing back against the ways we might subconsciously be continuing to colonize ourselves. So this was great. It was weird, it was unsettling, it was incredibly dynamic. Alvaro Enrique really seems to live in that strange, surrealist Mexican space, and I want to go there with him. I want to read so much more of his stuff. This story left me speechless. I think I gave it 4.5 stars, but honestly, it might be 5. On the world's most different note, after that I finally got a chance to pick up The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. This is a slightly fantastical contemporary adult romance. It kind of gives Lake House vibes, if that comparison helps. It's about this publicist named Clementine who had a really close relationship with her aunt who was very spontaneous and adventurous, and recently she's passed away, and in her will she left Clementine her apartment. So Clementine moves in because it's a free place to live, but she's always remembered her aunt describing this apartment as a special, kind of magical place. And sure enough, one day she finds a complete stranger standing in her kitchen, and through a series of misadventures adventures, she realizes that he is from 7 years in the past. So the apartment will randomly transport her 7 years into the past for very short periods of time. And of course, with those few and far between stolen moments, they begin to fall in love. Content warnings for explorations of familial death and grief, references to suicide, and some explicit sexual content. This is one of the best contemporary romances I've read in a minute, besides The Prospects, of course. That touch of magic just makes it so whimsical, but it's also such a tender look at what it means to undertake a journey of healing, and how equally difficult and beautiful that process can be. Both Clementine and Ewan, who's the other main character, are grieving a very profound loss in their lives, which is perhaps why the apartment brings them together in the first place. And through learning how to love each other, they're also learning how to make space for that loss, how to carry it with them into the future instead of letting it hold them back. So in a way, it's about the ways we learn to reorient ourselves around the loss of those we love, how we try to make sense of that loss despite the fact that the phenomenon of loss is inherently senseless, and how difficult it can be to place ourselves in a world that no longer has someone we love. One of the central themes of the story is learning how to love people as they are instead of as who we think they are or who we wish they would be, and how unconditionally accepting the truth of someone else may mean inviting in its own sense of loss as we grieve the divide between reality and our projected expectations. And that really ties into the romance because as Clementine and Ewan are falling for each other in this weird pocket of time and space, they're really falling for versions of each other that don't actually exist. We as humans don't exist in a static relationship to time. We're constantly changing with each and every day that we live. So this 7 years past version of Ewan doesn't exist in Clementine's timeline, and this 7 years in the future version of her doesn't and can't exist in his. So really, the predicament they find themselves in is demanding a much more radical kind of love from them, the kind of love that liberates the other person from expectations, that makes room for change and difference without fear of what that change might bring, and the freedom for the other person to be known as they are. It's honestly such an exuberant, big-hearted romance in so many ways. It really allows the reader to hold these profound feelings of joy, love, and comfort at the same time as loss, grief, and healing. And I think the undeniable emotional undercurrents of the story are part of what makes it so incredibly special. There was a moment reading this story where I just wept. And it wasn't even because the scene was especially sad, but just because there was a profound feeling of acceptance, accepting that to live means to open ourselves up to all the possibilities of life, both good and bad, and that life is still beautiful even when it's complicated. I loved it. I loved the dynamic between the two main characters. It was warm and sweet and welcoming and just right. I loved their willingness to keep searching for each other even in the most impossible circumstances and readying themselves to accept whatever and whoever they might find on the other side. And I just love that this story is about how loving someone means to change with them and because of them in so many ways. This was brilliant. It was an easy 5 stars. Then I decided to go with my Patreon pick for the month, and my patrons wanted me to listen to A Haunting on the Hill by Elizabeth Hand. I was granted access to the audiobook for review courtesy of Libra FM, and the audiobook is read by Carol Monda. This is the first ever authorized sequel or successor to The Haunting of Hill House, which is a pretty big deal to say the least. So it takes place at Hill House but set during modern day, and it's also queer, by the way, because we're following this struggling playwright named Holly and her girlfriend, who's a singer and composer, as they collaborate together on this production. Holly recently got awarded a pretty significant grant that's going to allow her to take a hiatus from her day job and work full-time on her play. So she really wants to get out of the city with her girlfriend Nisa and find some place to hunker down and just get to work. So they come across the abandoned Hill House and decide to invite some of the other actors and writers and creators to stay there with them as they rent the property for a few weeks. And if you know anything about Shirley Jackson's Hill House, I don't have to tell you that it doesn't quite go as planned. Content warnings for some references to infidelity, some instances of violence, non-graphic allusions to past grooming and sexual abuse, references to suicide, and some use of ableist language. I had a pretty good time with this. I didn't really have any expectations going into it. I've read the original Shirley Jackson story, which by the way is absolutely not something you have to do in order to understand or enjoy this, but I really don't have any loyalty to the original, so to speak. I really appreciate how this story seamlessly brings Hill House into the modern age, and I think it works because the unsettling thing about Hill House is how it feels like it exists outside of time. So no matter when an adaptation is set, that undeniable presence, that eerie wickedness, always overwhelms and always persists. I think Elizabeth Hand really understands what makes Hill House so frightening, which I think can be narrowed down to a couple of key things. First, that it's inherently unknowable. The rooms and the layout moves around, the hauntings don't follow any sort of logical progression, you can't predict when the next weird thing is going to happen, and no one experiences the house in the exact same way. Leading to the second and perhaps more important thing, which is that Hill House knows how to divide its inhabitants, prey on them individually, and gradually erode their shared sense of safety and trust. I think that's what makes Hill House such a lasting power no matter which iteration you find yourself engaging with. What's so terrifying about it is the experience of isolation, even when you're surrounded by other people. And I think the house is ultimately preying on everyone's sense of shame. I think fear is very closely related to shame, and by sort of tailoring the horrors that each individual person is being confronted with, the house is sowing these seeds of shame, because no one wants to admit what they're seeing or what they're going through, which ultimately divides them even further. And what prevents them from opening up about those things is the shame that comes from not being believed. That's a huge part of what makes Hill House so unsettling, how the characters are convinced that they're experiencing this horrible thing alone and they can't tell anyone about it, which I think really speaks to how a lot of people struggle with the instinct to suffer through things alone rather than reaching out to connect. It's creepy, it's weird, it's a sort of slow-boiling kind of haunting that gradually reaches an incredibly disturbing breaking point. The audiobook is also really well produced. There are songs as part of the play that actually get sung. You can hear like the rain against the rooftop, the wind in the trees, the sound of clicking against floorboards. It's super, super immersive. I wouldn't say there's anything especially notable about this book, but it very effectively accomplishes what it's trying to take on, both in being an homage to the original, but also being its own story. I was very thoroughly creeped out and I gave it 4 stars. I really did just allow myself to mood read in January for the most part, which is why on a complete whim I decided to then pick up my arc of A Tempest of Tea by Hafsa Faizal, which comes out on February 20th from Fievel and Friends. This is another interesting blend of genres. It's a YA historical fantasy with some paranormal elements to it. We're following a young orphan criminal mastermind and master blackmailer Arthi, who runs a tea house that doubles as an illegal blood house at night, where she caters to the city's vampires. But when her establishment is threatened, she's forced to strike a deal with an unlikely adversary to ensure that she won't lose her home and her business. This tenuous arrangement sends Arthi and her crew into a dangerous part of the city's underbelly known as the Ethereum, where the answers to all their problems are hidden behind highly secured walls. It's a heist. I'm trying to tell you it's a heist. Content warnings for references to colonization and massacre, descriptions of blood, graphic injury, and violence, and some explorations of parental death, sibling death, and grief. So I've never read anything by Hafsa Faizal before this. Her duology that starts with We Hunt the Flame has been locked into my TBR for quite some time, and I definitely still want to read it. With that in mind, I'll say that I really enjoyed A Tempest of Tea, but I didn't love it. But that's okay, because I'm still locked and loaded for book 2. I'm going to keep this fairly brief because I don't think I have anything especially profound to say. Again, first time reading anything from Hafsa Faizal, and just from reading this one book, I can definitively tell you what she does best, and that is drama, action, romance, and character dynamics. The rapport between the characters, the back and forth, the intensity burning underneath the surface of the relationships, both established relationships and entirely new ones that are still formulating, is absolutely the strongest part of the story. If you enjoy a good heist, you will most likely enjoy this. It delivers on all the typical elements that usually come with that: scheming, subterfuge, high stakes, a cute little found family crew. All of that is here and accounted for, and I thought it was pretty well done. on. I also appreciate the paranormal twist the story brings to that particular genre, but other than that, when it comes to the actual heist itself, it feels like pretty well-worn territory to me, nothing I haven't seen before. And again, there's nothing really wrong with that because it's functioning within the story the way it's intended to. I think what kept this story from going to the next level for me is that I felt like there was a lack of development. There's absolutely no shortage of excitement, but when it comes to the twist the story takes, I found them to be more jarring than effective because it feels like we're just blowing past the groundwork and going straight to the fireworks. So the pacing was a bit off for me. The world building I didn't always find effective either because we get a lot of it in these info dump sections, which again, perfectly serviceable, but not necessarily to my taste or especially effective. But to be perfectly clear, I was still thoroughly invested from start to finish. I was fully engaged, I was on the edge of my seat. I do think the final act is especially effective and really sets the stage for book 2 in a deliciously dramatic way, and I definitely want to see what happens next. All that to say, this was a solid introduction to Hafsa Faizal. I'm intrigued to read much more in the future. Again, this wasn't especially mind-blowing for me personally, but I did have a good time with it, and I'm super excited to see what comes next. I gave this 3.5 stars. After that, I decided to be spontaneous once again, and I picked up my arc of Don't Want You Like a Best Friend by Emma R. Albin, which actually already came out on January 9th from Avon. This is a sapphic historical romance set during the Victorian era. It's about two young, eligible debutantes, Beth and Gwen, who are embarking on their London season to find respectable husbands, but instead they find each other on the outskirts of the dance floor and become very fast friends. As they begin to connect, they realize that their widowed parents actually know each other and don't seem to like each other very much, so they start to suspect that there was perhaps something between them in the past. Because they don't actually want to put in any effort to find husbands for themselves, they decide to try their hand at matchmaking for their parents and give them a second chance at romance. But in the process, they realize that they're actually falling for each other. Content warnings for references to a past abusive marriage and instances of domestic abuse, allusions to an alcoholic parent, as well as instances of alcohol abuse and vomit, some experienced sexism and misogyny, instances of infidelity, and some explicit sexual content. This book is nowhere near worth taking up a huge chunk of my time and energy, so I'm not going to mince words. I'm just going to go straight for the kill. I hated this. This is the second time in as many months where I have been duped, I have been tricked, I have been hoodwinked, I have been promised a fun, romantic story, and instead I wasted days of my life reading something highly uncomfortable and problematic. I never do this, that's how you know it's serious, but in order to properly discuss my issues with this story, I will have to spoil it. So if you don't want that, which is entirely fair, feel free to skip ahead. I have chapters enabled so you can skip to the next one, you can use the timestamps below, scrub through till you see a different cover, dealer's choice. If you possess basic skills of deduction, you can probably guess from the synopsis, but my spidey senses were put on alert right away because I thought to myself, well, if this matchmaking scheme with their parents works, and their parents fall back in love and get married, that will make the characters stepsisters. Now, in my defense, I didn't actually think that would come to pass, because why would it? I thought, or rather, I hoped, that there were two possible scenarios. Either the two main characters would realize, oops, we're the ones falling in love, and then give up the ghost, let the matchmaking scheme fall to the wayside, you know, like normal people, or the parents would pick up the vibe from their daughters and be like, you know what, we had our chance at love, let's just reunite as friends and do the best by our children that we can, given the circumstances. And that's that. So I also do want to try to contextualize my criticism of this relationship choice as thoroughly as I can. Obviously, this time period was a very hostile one for queer people to live through. Compulsory heteronormativity was absolutely the norm at this time, and queer people had to find all kinds of creative and alternative situations in order to live safely or even remotely as themselves. I understand that. I respect that. I think we should have historical fiction that excavates all the ways that queer people have survived throughout history, because queer people have existed all throughout history, and at the same time, I still don't need a romance between stepsisters. I just don't. And I can hear the devil's advocates out there going, okay, but this arrangement was the best they could do at the time. They may be related by marriage, but they're not related by blood, so it's not that bad. But honestly, I can't even entertain those justifications, because for me, this is not a family dynamic that I care to rationalize, nor should I have to rationalize. There is a line. and I cannot go there with you. It is a line I cannot cross. So all of that I just shared would have been bad enough on its own, but even before that situation officially solidified itself, because there was a chance that it wasn't going to go that way, it wasn't even a good romance. And again, just to be perfectly clear, even if the romance had actually been good, that would not cancel out the end results. To say that it's not for me would not be strong enough language. I hated the way I felt when I finished this, and I was so upset that my time could have been better spent on literally anything else. Huge disappointment, to say the very least. I will not be reading the second book because I think I've seen everything I needed to see in this universe, and I will also not be rating this book for obvious reasons. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. And lastly for the month, and again on a very different note, I finally got a chance to listen to Belladonna. Not the gothic YA romantasy of the same name, but a story written by a Palestinian author named Ambara Salam. And once again, PRH Audio kindly allowed me to listen to the audiobook, which is read by Jill Winternitz. This is a queer historical coming-of-age story set in the 1950s. It starts at a Connecticut Catholic school with Bridget and her beautiful, inscrutable, wildly popular best friend Isabella. And when they graduate, they both get accepted into a prestigious Italian art history program hosted on the grounds of a silent convent. There, as Bridget experiences life outside her small hometown, she realizes that she can reinvent herself and become whoever she wants, except that Isabella knows who she really is underneath, and she might be keeping secrets from Bridget that could destroy the lives they're both trying to build. Content warnings for experienced racism, colorism, and xenophobic rhetoric, instances of bullying, allusions to disordered eating for a side character, some descriptions of chronic illness, and some explorations of an inappropriate sexual relationship between a minor and an adult. If you've been tuned into online book recommendations for books written by Palestinian authors, as you should be and as I encourage you to do, then you know this one's definitely been making the rounds, especially for queer lit written by Palestinian authors. But the review that really made me want to pick it up was from Annabelle at Lazy Library on TikTok, so if I can find that specific review, I will link it down below. Just like when I talked about You Exist Too Much, this is another story that is quintessentially queer and Palestinian, even though it's not necessarily direct in the ways it explores Palestinian experiences. I think stories like this, stories written by queer Palestinians about queerness, are so important to be reading right now because Palestinian creatives exploring queerness through their work is absolutely radical, especially when pinkwashing and queer Palestinian erasure remains a cornerstone of Zionist propaganda. So the main character of the story is actually Egyptian American, and I think it's important to contextualize this story not only by understanding the perspective from which the author is writing, but also understanding the historical and geographical context of that character choice, seeing as how Egypt is one of the countries neighboring Palestine through which many refugees and exiles have passed through in order to evacuate. So the subtext of the story and the positioning of the main character is very important to understand in that sense. But putting that aside for now, I was just really into this. I was telling my friends that this is absolutely categorically not a dark academia story, but it almost has those same vibes as these girls are coming of age in this Italian art school, and as their relationship really starts to morph into something codependent and obsessive. You know I support women's wrongs so much, and this is definitely that kind of story. It's not a feel-good first love kind of story. It's about these feelings and these fears that neither main character knows how to name, and how the way their lives get tangled up together inevitably starts to fester, starts to chafe, until they reach a breaking point. So there is that sense of darkness, there's suspense, even a little mystery towards the end. That's why I say the dark academia vibes are there, even though it's very much not that kind of story. It's also one of those if I can't have her, no one can type of dynamics, which is really great. Not like because it's super healthy, but because it's fascinating to read, especially when it's being queered in such interesting ways. But obviously the heart of the story is Bridget reinventing herself to the point where she's not even recognizable, to the point where it's impossible for her to maneuver without getting snagged in that tangled web of lies. And that's really compelling, especially because you understand her background background. You understand the assumptions that people make about her and her family. As heartbreaking as it is, you understand why she would want this chance to become the person that people back home would never allow her to be because of all those assumptions. And ultimately, I think what the story is trying to say is that when we forsake the truth of ourselves, we are the ones who lose the most. We can bend over backwards, we can go to all these lengths to contort ourselves into what we think other people want us to be, and it will still never be enough. All of that to say, I really enjoyed this. It's really subtly sinister, yet still a sun-drenched coming-of-age story at the same time about these two girls who don't know how to love each other and don't know how to love themselves. I do think it gets a little too on the nose towards the end, but this was still fantastic. I gave it 4.5 stars. So those are the 8 books I read in January. Lots of highs, one very pointed low, but that's okay. I still enjoyed what I picked up for the most part, and even found some new favorites. If you've read any of these books, -1, I'd love to talk about them with you down below in the comments, or feel free to tell me what you read last month yourself. That's everything I had to share for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.